Hey folks, today we're going to talk about the PlayStation. Just the word PlayStation is practically synonymous with video games in this day and age, and after 3 systems and a handheld, and soon a second handheld, the brand isn't going anywhere. It's so ubiquitous in our culture that computer spell checkers know to capitalize the S in PlayStation, assuming you know enough to type it as one word and not two like some grandma looking for Nintendo tapes. The well-known controller layout, the built-in rumble most of the time, the symbols X, square, triangle, and circle, it's something that we're all familiar with. The original PlayStation console was a huge success. It was the first console to ever sell 100 million units, something that took 9.5 years, which is already an impressive lifespan for a console, and Sony didn't stop producing them until the console was 11 years old. It was the first console to successfully challenge the dominance that Nintendo held over the market since the NES was released way back in 1986. The PlayStation 2 was also a huge success, and it is still produced today over 10 years after its initial release. The PlayStation Portable and PlayStation 3 have both gotten slow starts, but are generally catching up in terms of both sales and the quality of their libraries. So the story goes that the PlayStation was something originally conceived by Nintendo. And when you think about it, that's kind of fucked up, isn't it? Did Nintendo give birth to their greatest and longest living enemy like some sort of mad scientist? Well, yeah, sort of, but the details are very different than the story that's typically told. The typical story goes back to the 16-bit era, where Nintendo was dominant with their Super NES console, but faced constant competition from Sega and their Genesis console, which was always not too far behind. When Sega released an add-on for the Genesis that used CD technology, the Sega CD, which boasted better graphics, better games, and according to Sega's marketing would probably give you a handjob from time to time, Nintendo felt threatened by this and planned to counter with their own CD add-on, which Sony worked on for them. Nintendo then scrapped the idea when the Sega CD turned out to actually suck rancid gorilla foreskin, and Sony took what they had created so far and released it as a standalone console, the PlayStation. The original add-on was going to be called the PlayStation X, which is why the PlayStation is commonly abbreviated as PSX back in the day, despite there being no X in the name of the console. Well, some of that is true, some of it is distorted, and some of it, yep, bullshit. The idea that it was the Sega CD that prompted Nintendo to look into a CD add-on for the Super NES is the first fallacy. Nintendo had been interested in the idea for a long time, before CDs were even common. They had a disc add-on for the Japanese version of the NES, the Famicom, called the Famicom Disk System, using the then-current technology of writable magnetic discs, commonly called floppy disks. The problem is that the add-on was unreliable, the disks were easily damaged or erased, and because there was no form of copy protection and floppy disks were extremely user-friendly, piracy was a big issue. When the CD-ROM was developed, it promised to curb these issues by not being only more powerful and with bigger capacity, but being harder to copy, as CD burners were not then common household items, and they were more durable than floppies and couldn't be accidentally erased by magnets or whatever. The CD-ROM was jointly developed by 2 companies, one being Sony, the other being Philips. Nintendo chose Sony to work with because one of their engineers, Ken Kutaragi, had previously made a presentation on processing chips for the Super NES that was convincing enough to have them use a Sony chip in that console, and they wanted to do business with him again. So, the story that Sega CD prompted Nintendo to do this is false. As a matter of fact, Nintendo's add-on was in development first. The contract between Sony and Nintendo was drafted in 1988, the same year the Genesis was released in Japan. But the story that the Sega CD's failure prompted Nintendo to stop production of the add-on is also false. The reason that Nintendo stopped production is actually due to a poor contract between them and Sony. Upon reading the contract, the president of Nintendo, Hiroshi Yamauchi, discovered that due to the way it was written, Sony would gain complete control over all the games released for the CD add-on, and he quickly had the contract terminated and struck a new deal with Philips. The deal with Philips also would not last, as Nintendo ultimately decided that they didn't want to work with CD-ROMs after all, even sticking with cartridges for their next console, the Nintendo 64, which many see as being their worst business decision since entering the consumer electronics market. Philips would go on to create the CDI, and due to leftover legalese from their contract with Nintendo, actually released 3 Zelda games and a Mario game, all of them falling well short of Nintendo's usual quality and being remembered today mostly as a joke. But let's back up and talk about what happened with Sony. The story goes that they took the technology that they had come up with and decided to release it as a standalone console. And this much is true, but it's not the PlayStation that hitched store shelves, and it didn't happen easily. Firstly, Nintendo immediately filed an injunction claiming that they owned the name PlayStation and that Sony had no right to do this, but this was shot down in court. However, the PlayStation console, shown in 1991 at trade shows, is almost completely unrelated to the PlayStation that was released a few years later. And yes, I said 1991, the year the Super NES was released in America. It's rumored that the standalone PlayStation, spelled as 2 words by the way, was produced in a quantity of only around 200, likely to be tested and shown at trade shows. As the development of the console continued, so did the overtures of a future relationship with Nintendo. While the project was originally envisioned as a way to play CD games on the Super NES, the two companies made a deal in 1992, in which Sony's console would have a port that took Super NES cartridges, with Nintendo owning the rights to and receiving most of the money from the sales of the cartridge games. But this also never happened, as Sony decided to rebuild the project from scratch and adopt a new marketing strategy that targeted a new generation of gamers. The idea of having a port for Super NES games was dropped, and the PlayStation was born, as one word. Oh, and the thing about the X in PSX, it was nothing more than an internal code used to refer to the system that just got out onto the internet when it was in development, and it just stuck. This was probably confused by Sony actually releasing a PSX in 2003. It was a DVR PlayStation and PlayStation 2 combo. And yeah, that does sound awesome, but don't get too excited. It was only released in Japan and was pretty much a failure because it was ridiculously expensive. One last thing about the origin of the PlayStation was that as much as the entire thing must have really pissed off Nintendo, it had an even bigger rage-inducing effect on Atari, who were trying to market their ridiculous Jaguar system. The 64-bit Jaguar was already struggling against the existing 16-bit consoles, the Super NES and the Genesis. This was due to the fact that the Super NES and the Genesis are good, and the Jaguar was a piece of snail shit. However, as bad as Atari were doing at the time, the upcoming Saturn and PlayStation consoles were really making them shit their pants. And Sam Tramiel, the CEO of Atari, tried to claim that the Jaguar was more powerful than the Sega Saturn, an idea that, if you're extremely kind, could be described as laughable. He said that the PlayStation may be slightly more powerful than his console, but that the PlayStation was probably going to cost like $500, because apparently he thought it was impossible for something as awesome as the PlayStation to be affordable. He even went so far as to put his reputation on the line by claiming that if Sony released the console for less than $500, it would be an example of price dumping, and he would sue to block sales of the console. The PlayStation was released for $300, and Sam Tramiel didn't waste the time of any court with his ridiculous bullshit, and the world pretty much forgot about his stupid claim and the Atari Jaguar. So, there you have the true origin of the PlayStation. Hope you learned something. Join me next time and we'll talk about why Capcom had to juggle the names of some of their most popular characters around.